Welcome to An Honorable Profession, a podcast giving America hope since 2018. I'm Ryan Coonerty. Along with Debbie Cox-Bolton of the New Deal, I'm lucky enough to be your co-host. An Honorable Profession is a New Deal Leaders podcast. The New Deal is an organization that supports the next generation of American leaders. From attorneys generals to state senators to mayors to school board members, these are the people that are pushing policies and politics that will respond to climate change, rebuild our economy, address racial injustice, and restore our democracy. These are incredibly talented people who have dedicated themselves to public service when their country and their communities needed it the most. Check out newdealleaders.org to see what I'm talking about. From the New Deal's annual conference, I am speaking today to Nevada Treasurer Zach Conine. Zach has led a bunch of innovative efforts around college savings, creating a rainy day fund, and we're going to talk about his path from the private sector into the Treasurer's office and why everyone should care about who their state and county treasurers are. So Zach, welcome to An Honorable Profession.
Thanks so much for having me.
So let's talk about that. I happen to think that being a treasurer is the best, most undervalued job in elected office. Tell me about why you may or may not agree with that after a couple years of service.
Well, I certainly do, and I'm sure every other treasurer does, and probably my wife and two of my three kids probably agree with you. But outside of that, I think you're right. And functionally, the treasurer is one of those jobs that people don't think about generally, and that's not bad. Like, it's okay for there to be parts of government that we don't have to think about all the time. In fact, I would argue that in the past couple of years, we've had to spend a lot more time thinking about government working than perhaps just everyday citizens, and Nevadans specifically, should have to think. But generally, the treasurer is the state's chief investment officer, right? And so we've tried to use that to take a long-term view of government. So much of government is just, how do I get to the next election? How do I get through the next election? How do I get through the next legislative cycle? And these sort of very small micro wins and losses. And we've tried to take the position and think more about the long term, not just how's it going to work over a 4-year term, but how's it going to work over 8 years? How's it going to work over 20 years? Because most of the work that needs to be done in government isn't really short-term fixes. It's long-term structural changes.
And give us a sense of the size of those investments and, how you think about creating returns for the long term and where that money should go.
For sure. So in Nevada, to scope it, we've got about 3 million people in the state, 3.2 million people in the state. Most of those live in Las Vegas. The size of our general fund when I got there was about $2.6 billion. Now it's about $9.3 billion.
Wow.
A lot of reasons for that, but some of which is the work that we've done, right? We've got a rainy day fund that's about $1.2 billion, which is about 4 times larger than it's ever been. We've got a pension in the mid 40s. We've got about $37 billion of college savings assets, not because Nevadans are saving more for college, but because our programs are so good that people come from other states to invest with us. But we think about investments in the long term, looking at ways that we can fix structural government problems, right? And one of those, it's pretty easy to understand because this happened in almost every state, was that during the middle of the pandemic, we had systems, unemployment systems, that could not handle the volume. Right? And in Nevada, we had a system that hadn't been invested in about 20 years. It was programmed in a language called COBOL, which for any of your listeners who have programmed COBOL, congratulations, and make sure you're getting your discounts for eating early. It is not a language where it's super robust. Maybe it was 20 years ago when they built it. And so we found a system that worked when we had 200 people filing for unemployment, but when we had to shut down gaming in March of 2020, and all of a sudden we had 20,000, 30,000 people, all the manual processes that were in place to make that system work didn't work anymore. They didn't scale. And so a lot of our work, a lot of our investing is remembering the social safety nets that didn't work during the pandemic. Things like unemployment, things like all of the individuals who were at risk of housing loss, right? Nevada's 105,000 affordable housing units shy of where we need to be, and trying to make investments in the long term, because you can't fix a problem like that quickly, right? We couldn't just run to Best Buy and get the upgraded version of the unemployment software and deploy it. We need to fix it when we have the time and the resources, and that time is now.
Yeah, so tell me, you got elected in 2018, so you didn't have much runway in office before the pandemic hit, and You're now managing a global pandemic, which was affecting markets, right, that your pension funds are invested in, as well as having these systems. Bring us back to that time and how you tried to mobilize government to respond to this challenge.
Yeah, we try not to think too much about it, but it did unveil a lot of things. There's a Charlie Munger quote that I like a lot, which is when the tide goes out, you can see who's wearing a swimsuit, right? And in periods of prosperity, states, especially states like Nevada, which are very sort of boom and bust historically, gaming revenue, hospitality revenue, sales tax, big driver of our economy. When things start getting a little worse, you start seeing where the holes are in an interesting way and can start to fix those. But at the beginning of the pandemic, right, when we found out we were going to shut the state down about 2 days later from when we heard the decision that was made a couple hours before we heard, the first question was, how do we protect and make sure that state functions keep going? And that was a payroll question. Can we make payroll for state employees? Are we going to be able to meet our obligations and all the vendors and all the people who are counting on the state to actually pay its bills, right? Are we going to be able to keep SNAP benefits going and WIC benefits going? Are we going to be able to make sure that veterans are going to be able to get what they need and that those state-sponsored homes are going to be able to be sponsored? So the first step was cash flow, right? Are we going to be okay from a cash flow perspective? And we were going to be okay, right? At least for some amount of time. We didn't know how big the downturn was going to be and how long, and so you start being a little bit more conservative about how you're investing and trying to make sure that you've got money to pay the bills. That's kind of step one for any treasurer, right? Because if you can't pay the bills, all the other fun stuff you might be trying to do, no one's really going to care about because of the torches and the pitchforks and whatnot. And so we dealt with that. And then our next step was trying to back up from the immediate health crisis, right? I don't know if you remember this, but on the internet, pretty much everyone became an epidemiologist right away, which was great, right? So we had millions of epidemiologists, and we felt we should go where the ball wasn't and started spending time on what are the long-term economic drivers, what are the things we can try to get in front of. And we went back and we had pretty good data about what had happened to the state during the Great Recession, right? Another period of slowdown. And in Nevada, housing instability is economic instability. Our largest revenue drivers are based on consumption. People have to feel comfortable buying things. People have to feel comfortable gaming, right? Whether or not they're in Nevada or they're coming from somewhere else into Las Vegas or Reno or anywhere else to gamble. They have to be comfortable spending money. And in the Great Recession, as the foreclosure crisis expanded and people were at risk of losing their homes, we knew that they would not, they stopped spending money. When they stopped spending money, then the government had to contract. When the government had to contract, the weakest among us got hurt the most, as they always do. So how do we avoid that? And in Nevada, we went first at foreclosures. And with foreclosures, we knew, right, from our work with banks and our work in the private sector, that the decisions the banks had made in 2008, 2009, 2010 to push families into foreclosure was broadly not effective for them, right? Not only did it make them look like cartoon villains, right, but it just financially wasn't effective. And so we started reaching out, and California Governor Newsom had effectively bullied the banks into offering forbearance, bullied in the nicest possible way, bullied the banks into offering forbearance to their folks, not requiring people to miss payments to go into a foreclosure avoidance process. Because remember, from a credit perspective, if you had a foreclosure during the Great Recession, that probably happened in 2012, 2013, 7 years to get it off your credit. So you would have just gotten to a place where you could get back into sort of a normal credit universe. And then the pandemic happened, right? We knew we had to stop that. That just created a malaise for half a decade in Nevada. And so we reached out to these banks and we said, hey, this didn't work for you last time. We offer forbearance to Nevadans, because if you don't offer forbearance to Nevadans, it's going to be a problem for like everybody. Now, one of the interesting things you mentioned, sort of the curiosity of being treasurer. When I first took the job, a lot of people came up to me and they were like, look, it's a great job, but nobody knows what the treasurer does. Well, here's the other thing. Nobody knows what the treasurer doesn't do. And so when we start calling banks and saying in the nicest Harry Reid-esque tones, like, hey, we think this would be good for you, don't you think this would be good for you? They didn't know that the treasurer has absolutely no oversight authority over banks at all. But they would all take the call. And so we got them all to offer forbearance to Nevadans. And so we did what any good politician would do. We got on social media and TV and everything else like, oh, we got forbearance, Nevadans, congratulations. Like, we're here for you. Moving on. Yeah. And then Nevadans started calling the banks to get the thing that we had told them we had gotten for them. and they ran into the same kind of customer service problem that we'd run into back when I was in the gaming industry, right? Great idea, great casino promotion, doesn't make its way down necessarily to the people answering the phones. So the people on the phones are like, we don't know what you're talking about. You got to go into miss a couple of payments, go into forbearance. Now, thankfully, Nevadans are not shy. And so we started getting calls, right? We started getting calls from folks that were like, hey, you said that we were going to get this, and I called and we don't get this. What the hell? And that happened a couple of times, and we called back to the banks, and they were like, yeah, it just hasn't made its way down. And eventually what we started doing is I would get, Susie Nevadan on the phone. She'd call in, right, have it sent to me. And then I'd call the vice president from the bank on the other line and merge the two calls together. And be like, hey, Bob, I know you offered forbearance to Nevadans. That's so great, so good of you. I actually have a Nevadan on the line who wasn't able to get the forbearance from whichever bank or mortgage service company. Would you sort this out? And we found we had to do that about twice with each bank, right? But that type of direct involvement, I think, helped to make a difference there. And that helped us remove one of the big risk things off the table. Because in the pandemic, at least from our perspective, it was about risk triage. How do we remove the sort of biggest concern, right, state insolvency, and then go to the second biggest concern, which was people not being able to stay inside their homes. That then, of course, translated into rental assistance work and a lot of work in that place, and then into the support of businesses, specifically small businesses, specifically businesses owned in disadvantaged communities, to make sure that they were still going to make it through, right? So just sort of trying to move risk off the table at a time of massive uncertainty.
So you came from the private sector, and I think how you describe it, it's a good understanding of pressures that private sectors face and how the private sector thinks about it that then the public sector can leverage or complement. So tell us about that path from the private sector into the public sector. What's been surprising? What's hasn't been surprising? How has it informed your governance?
I think that a lot of people will say the government should work more like a business, right? And it is deeply not that, right? I think one of the things to remember is the stakeholder group is very different. In a business, your stakeholders are the owners of the business, arguably, and should be the employees of the business. If you're a public company, you've got stockholders, right? Like those are the people who you are trying to create more value for. In a state perspective, your stakeholders are everyone, not just the people who voted for you, not just the people who donated to you, but everyone in the state. And so you think about that work more in a rising tide than a picking winners or losers. And that's a different mindset. And it causes you, I think, to triage things based on not just what will create the most value for a segment, but what can be done quickly, what can be done well, and what has the broadest impact, right? Getting forbearance for the 600,000 or so 100,000 Nevadans who own a home helped. Moving on to then the people who were in apartments helped, right? But we didn't spend our time saying, okay, here's a community that has, right, this need because all these other communities had a need, right? So you spend that time a little more broadly. I moved from the private sector into the public sector like so many Nevadans in public office because Harry Reid told my wife he thought I should run for treasurer, right? I was running a small consulting company. We were a couple of hundred employees under management, a bunch of restaurants, some other hospitality plays, right? It was great. It was totally fine. And my wife, who is much smarter and better looking than I am, was an intern for Senator Reid back in the day, and she was a dean at the law school, and he was teaching at the law school post leaving the Senate. And one day kind of waved her over and said, hey, I think your husband should run for Senate for treasurer. Come see me. And she was okay and called his assistant, said, when can we come by? And he said, how about Thursday at 1? And I said, oh, we have a conflict, like, with 2 work. And she's like, yeah, what about Thursday at 1? And so we moved the thing. We went to meet the senator. It was a fascinating conversation, as most people who have had that conversation will tell you. Not a long one. And then we were kind of off to the races, right? Public service seems to me like a wonderful way to give back to a state that's given me so much, right? I moved out to Nevada right after college to Laughlin, Nevada. It was 126 degrees when I got there. I lived in a motel actually in Bullhead City, Arizona for about 6 months before moving up to Las Vegas and grew in the gaming community, got to do some really neat things in finance, went to law school at night before opening another casino, opened a bunch of restaurants, met my wife. We've got 3 amazing kids. Like, we've gotten so much out of the state. and it seemed like this was an opportunity to give a little bit back.
Tell me Senator Reid's pitch. Like how does he take
Pitch.
somebody who has a nice life and say, you know what you should do is make your life really hard for a fraction of the money?
Yeah, and so many people have so many great Senator Reid stories. I was reading the one earlier today. A colleague down at NewDEAL showed me the story from President Obama's last book about the conversation that he and Senator Reid had, which was effectively it wasn't a pitch.
Yeah.
And that's an important thing to know with Senator Reid. He would tell you about things that were happening in the future as though they had happened yesterday. And so when we met him, he came in and he said, I think you're going to be a great treasurer. Not the best treasurer, probably top 5, maybe top 3. I don't know. He looks at my wife. He says, he's going to be a great treasurer, don't you think? He looks at me. He's like, you're going to be a great treasurer. What do we have to talk about? And he sits down. And I said, well, sir, I have some questions. And he said, why? Right. And we talked through a couple of the concerns I had moving, but it was a 20-minute conversation, right? And the rest of our conversations, primarily from then on for the next couple of years, were text-based, and we see each other at an event or whatever. But he was not a man who used 10 words when 5 would suffice, and certainly not a man that would use 5 words when no words would suffice. But he was right? And whatever the thing was, he saw whatever the opportunity and the fit, right? Whatever combination of political, practical experience, for whatever reason, right? It gives us an opportunity to do this work. And we've tried to lean in as much as possible to make the Treasury not just something that has to exist, but something that can create other value, right?
Let's talk about other value. So you've been on the forefront of creating opportunities for people to invest for college savings, create more resiliency for the next downturn. Tell me about the things you're excited about that you're working on that are outside of the sort of the nuts and bolts of managing the investments for the state of Nevada.
Yeah, I think when we look at kind of long-term investing, all investing is taking a little bit of opportunity off the table now to create more later, right? It's the millennials, of which I am one, which I'm constitutionally required to mention, but it's the millennials not buying that avocado toast so we can get the house, right? But in actuality, it's taking a little bit of money and saving for college. We have programs like prepaid tuition, which is in its 25th year right now, where someone who bought that program for their child who's using it now would have paid $6,000 for 4 years of college and gotten $26,000 worth of value. That's pretty good, right? When people are saving for higher education. And that's been a change for us, and I think is a change for a lot of folks in the higher education space. It's not just about college anymore, right? When I grew up, it was university or we're never going to talk to you again. And that worked out for me, but that's not everybody's path. And realizing that government needs to support and help folks who want to get a great job into the middle class by joining a union and getting an apprenticeship, getting a certificate degree, right? All of those things, we need to be able to support them. And in the Treasury, we want to not just give people the tools, but make sure that we are adjusting and changing the tools for the population. Here's an example. A lot of college savings offices, certainly the Nevada Treasury when we got there, were very, very focused on selling stuff, right? And so it was like we were always talking about how important it was that individuals were housed. You got to have a roof over your head. It's in the hierarchy. Like, you need these things, right? And then people would say, oh, my God, that's great. I do need a roof over my head. How can I do that? And we were like, well, let me sell you a mortgage, right? We weren't actually providing the thing. We were trying to sell tools that could be a route to the thing. And so we've really shifted the branding and the focus of our college savings work around helping people plan for, save for, and pay for. Not just here are ways that if you're in a certain tax bracket, you can save a bunch of money by not paying taxes through a 529, though that's great. People should use the tool. But making sure that we have a scholarship database that brings all these things together. Providing services. This has been a big one. Nevada is pretty low on the list from a FAFSA creation, the free application for federal student aid, the thing you have to fill out to get Pell Grants and subsidized staff loans. Nevada's always been pretty far down the list. It's not because people don't have the need. It's not because they wouldn't apply. It's because the FAFSA is sort of a pain in the butt to fill out. And so we've worked at the state level to make sure there were resources available, but we've also worked at the federal level to get them to change around the form so that for first-generation students, for students where the family does not speak English as a primary language, they're able to get through that process because that money is out there, right? A lot of our work is less about coming up with some sort of brave new idea and more about the nuts and bolts execution of that idea when it actually hits people, right? It's much less theoretical, I think. And a lot of good government, in our experience, is that, right? It's not putting a man on the moon. It's making sure that a guy knows that he has money in his pocket. He just has to fill out a certain form, or he needs to go to a certain place.
I do feel like that is a value that you could bring from the private sector, because most businesses, right, there's a million great ideas. It's all about execution and meeting your customer where they are.
Yeah.
And so I did that mindset. Did your experience help inform some of these efforts on a focus on execution? Because in politics, there's a big temptation to come up with a new idea, send out a press release, and then frankly kind of forget about whether it's being executed well or not.
The mission accomplished banner behind you, right? And
Yeah.
right at the beginning of the mission. And it still happens. It's the incentive structure isn't necessarily set up in the way that you would want to avoid it, right? The incentive structure is to get that hashtag and those retweets and then not actually execute. That has never really struck me as a good use of time. And there are so many pieces of government that we've found in the state where someone has come up with a great idea, passed a piece of legislation, done the press release on it, and then never followed up. No one in the executive branch has ever executed on it. And so functionally, all of that work was wasted. And in the private sector, that doesn't happen as much, generally because the work to get to that place is coming out of someone or some group's pocket. And in the state, in government, it's often coming out of sort of this amorphous government pocket, right? And so the accountability isn't always there. But there is so much good government work that can be done just executing on the stuff that you're supposed to be doing, finding ways to remove those friction points, right? Looking at things that government's done for a long time and saying, do we need to do this, right? Is there some sort of constitutional or statutory reason to do it, right? Are we just doing it because the last guy did it, or last gal did it? And pushing on those, right? Because the worst thing about government is momentum, right? We are going to do the same thing we did yesterday, today. We're going to do the same thing tomorrow that we did today, right? We're just going to keep doing the same work. The best thing about government is momentum. If you have something oriented in the right way, there isn't a ton of motivation to screw it up for the sake of screwing it up. It's not the case in the private sector, right? In the private sector, you want to put your own thumbprint on it, right? You want to make sure that I come from the restaurant space. You want to make sure that the happy hour is your idea, right? But a lot of times that's sort of chaos for the sake of chaos, right? It's change for the sake of change. You don't get a ton of that in government, at least not on the law side, but on the executive branch side, because most executive branch employees, most civil servants, they're not in it for the chaos, right? They want to have a good job and they want to have an okay pension and they want to make sure they can go home and spend time with their kids, right? They're not looking for the firefight. And so helping to orient those civil servants in a direction that is more effective generally sticks. And so when we spend the time doing that to take a process and really strip it down to its core, to the requirements, and then build up the way around it, we found that to be remarkably lucrative from an efficacy perspective.
I think that's exactly right. Yeah, I like your insight about momentum being both the best and the worst thing, and more momentum and less inertia is always good. Let's move from governance to politics.
Yeah.
You are in a swing state that will, make big decisions for not only the state of Nevada, but frankly for the entire world. How are things looking right now?
I think Nevada, well, let's look at the last election and let's look at the next one, right? So the last election, all the statewide candidates were up. The 6 constitutional officers, I used to refer to us as the 6 cons. I've been asked to stop. But the 6 constitutional officers were up last time, and we split them, went 3-3. Right, it was we had 5 Democrats and 1 Republican going into the election. Our governor, Governor Sisolak, a Democrat, lost, the only incumbent governor to lose in the country, to Governor now Lombardo, who's a Republican. Our lieutenant governor spot switched, and our controller, who's basically the state's chief accountant, a counterpart of mine, switched from a Democrat to a Republican. And we kept the treasurer's role and then the secretary of state and the attorney general, right? And what we found in Nevada, I think, is true in a lot of places, and we saw it last week in Kentucky. Candidates matter, right? A lot of folks are or chirping and spending time talking about how great the reaction and the result was in Kentucky, where we won the governor's race, and that is good. That is great. But we lost the treasurer, the auditor, the secretary of state, the attorney general, every other statewide race we lost, and not by a little bit, right? By 8 points, by 10 points in these races. The candidates matter, right? And I think what we're certainly seeing in places like Nevada is that the voter is, thankfully, aware enough that when there are candidates, the attorney general, the secretary of state, and I all ran against this is a legal term for that, but wackadoos, right? And that mattered, right? We were able to break apart from the pack. Senator Cortez Masto, who won re-election, has been doing an amazing job in the state, talking to Democrats, talking to Republicans, talking to independents, talking to our rural communities, which are easy to sort of ignore if you want to just look at the math, right? 2 million people in Clark County, and why are you going to go out to West Wendover? But there are voters out there, and there are people out there that matter. And we won because we pulled Republican votes over to the Democratic side. And so when I take that and look at what happened in Kentucky, and then look at that as it moves to national, we have to be able to go and meet people where they are. We have to realize that, Senator Reid always said, like, every blade of grass, right? Like, don't leave an election uncontested, because if you do, you're definitely not going to win any votes if you don't try, right? And you're going to win some if you do. And so when we look at 24, I think that is so important from a national perspective. We have a Senate race. Senator Rosen's up. It's so important from that Senate race. We have assembly races and Senate races all up and down the state. Candidates matter. They're always going to matter. And I think it is to our disservice when we just assume that the demographics are destiny, right? We've got to do the hard work on the ground.
And just out of curiosity, for those of us who are outside Nevada, I'm a Californian, and we want to help and assist in Nevada, what are the things that you're looking for from the party, from people who are thinking about the president's reelection? How best can they leverage their energies in your state?
Yeah, it's great. And there are groups that do this type of work. There's a friend of ours who has a group called Sister District, right, which is basically taking areas that are just very hard D, that are going to be D, that don't need to turn out voters, and bringing that energy and helping to knock doors in other states, right? So certainly there's always an opportunity to come to the state and knock doors, to work with whatever operation the Culinary puts up, to work with the state Democratic Party, which we had a little bit of moment where we were more of a Democratic Socialists of America state party. That's over, right? We had our crazy college time, but now we're back to paying our bills. And so, the Democratic Party is as strong as it's ever been. With both a combination of sort of the old Reid machine folks as well as newer folks who maybe came out of that but didn't grow up in it. And so, you can work through the parties. Our labor organizations are going to be a massive piece of the turnout effort, as they always are. And so that's how to help. I mean, you can always send money. We always appreciate it when people send money. We certainly won't turn it away. But in Nevada, it's a door-to-door game. We are winning at the door as we are winning at the doorbell.
What's next for you? How do you think about where you can best serve and what Senator Reid would want you to do versus what your family and other folks may want you to do?
Yeah, I think Senator Reid would tell me, and I would try not to presume, and assuming, unfortunately, since we lost him a few years ago, I don't know that I'll ever get good color on that. I do know that, his focus was always on letting people find their own path and then sharply correcting them when he thought that path wasn't right. So we'll take the first part and try to run with it. For us, we are really focused on how do we use the time in front of us as effectively as possible. I've got 3 years and 1 month. It's about 1,000 days. And so how do we take the work that we've done and make sure that it's not just inertia, right, to your point, but it's momentum. How do we make sure that we have solidified and calcified the things that we want to solidify and calcify? And part of that's triage, right? What's the work that we are sure we can get done and execute? What's the work that we want to set up and have ready for the next person? How do we make sure that the Treasury, which has changed pretty significantly in the 5 years I've been there, either stays changed or more effectively remains nimble enough to go where it needs to go and where it can help people? right? From a political side, we are spending a lot of time thinking about what's next. Best advice I ever got from a fellow who ran a company that I worked for, a hedge fund that I worked for, portfolio manager, was his entire thing was about keeping his opportunity cost as high as possible. At any time, he wanted to be doing the thing that he wanted to be doing the most. He wanted it to be hard to change directions because what he was doing was so good in anything. And that's where we are, right? Like, my life is amazing. My kids are amazing. My wife's amazing. We have 2 great dogs, Democracy and Keno, because Vegas, and we are trying to do as much good work as we can. I have an amazing team around us, both political and governance, and so we just want to make sure to maximize that time as much as possible. And if we end up running for something else, that's great, and we're going to do everything we can to win it. If we end up going back to the private sector, that's great, and we're going to do everything we can to make that effective and help as many people as possible. Our opportunity costs are high, and I feel comfortable with that.
That was my last question, actually, was about your dog named Democracy. And do you ever get in trouble for yelling, "No, Democracy, no"?
It's so Democracy. So there were 2, Democracy and Liberty. Liberty passed away about a month and a half ago, but they have had really long lives. They're both rescue dogs. They're German Shepherd Corgis, which is a very strange thing. It's probably best not to think too much about it. But and they weren't related, and they both came out of the Great Recession. And so Democracy was actually left in a house, unsupervised, a deeply tragic thing, for a couple of days, and was just in an awful state, right? So his middle name is Freddie, and Liberty's middle name was Fanny. And the 2 of them came together, and we got Libby as a puppy, and she lived to be 17. Democracy's about 19 right now. Wow. It's very strange. I'm not suggesting that I should start like some sort of dog longevity company, but I could. And Keno came and joined our family a couple of weeks ago after Liberty passed, because Democracy had never been with another dog, and he just got weird anxious right away. And so Keno's middle name is Tonopahs, which doesn't really mean anything for anybody outside Nevada, but Tonopah is a small town about halfway between Reno and Nevada and Las Vegas. Dogs are great. Pets are great. I don't really like cats. It's just I'm allergic. But dogs are great, and there's something about unconditional love that you get from your family. You certainly get from dogs, and you absolutely will never get from voters, and that's okay.
Yeah. It's not a bad thing after a long day to come home and be welcomed instead of being told about potholes and other problems that people are facing.
Yes. The dogs have never brought up ESG, which I appreciate.
Well, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for being a member of the New Deal. We are excited to have you as part of this, and I think that we have a number of really smart treasurers in New Deal. And I think that when you look at the collective impact that New Deal's had over time, a big part is because we've had treasurers do a lot of work around college savings and other programs that have profoundly impacted their communities and been able to be replicated in other states. And so thank you for everything you do.
Well, thank you for having us, and thanks for doing this podcast, right? Because especially during and coming out of the pandemic, the conversations around how those ARPA dollars were going to get invested, what communities were doing to recover. I mean, New Deal was so necessary at that time. I joined in the middle of the pandemic, and information both from the podcast but also from other sources through New Deal helped us do a better job. And I think, like, if there's an organization that can help its members get better at the thing that made them join in the first place, can't be better than that.
Thank you. It's kind of you to say. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
An Honorable Profession is a New Deal Leaders podcast. Thanks to the team at New Deal for producing this episode. We encourage you to bring honor to public service, and because we keep things honorable, no tax dollars are used in the making of this podcast.